Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a very special webinar on Millennium Challenge Cooperation, MCC and Nepal. NICE is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank based in Kathmandu that undertake independent research and activities on issues of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and issues of development. Major research area of NICE are issue-related foreign policy, security strategy, economy, cybersecurity, migration, disaster management, climate change, and energy. At the time when there is increasing contested and polarized debates taking place on MCC in Nepal, we are organizing this discussion to understand MCC, address the misinformation and disinformation surrounding MCC debates in Nepal. To talk on the topic of today, we have three very senior experts who have closely followed the MCC and other development projects of the government of the United States of America. We have Sarah Rose. Sarah Rose is a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. Her work are part of the center's US Development Policy Initiative, focuses on US government aid initiatives. Previously, Rose worked for the United Nations Agency for International Development in Mozambique as a specialist in strategic information and monitoring and evaluation. She also worked at MCC, focusing on the agency's country selection and eligibility process. Similarly, we also have Conor Savoy. Conor Savoy is a senior fellow with the project on prosperity and development at the Center for Strategy and International Studies. Prior to CSIS, he was the executive director of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, where he closely followed US government development agencies, implementing partners, Congress, and other stakeholders to advance a positive aid reform agenda. In addition to his work at CSIS, he frequently consults with US government agencies, NGOs, and other implementing partners and the private sectors on evolving trends in international development. Similarly, we also have Jim Mazzarella, who is a senior vice president of policy and communications at the Center for Global Development. He joined GIF after serving at the White House National Security Council as Senior Director for Global Economics and Development, where he was one of the primary architects of the new US International Development Finance Corporation, and over a decade at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the American aid agency that focuses on impact evaluation at a core tenant. This will be a 60-minute discussion, and the program is streaming live on several Facebook pages and social media platforms. We'd like to request all our participants to tweet about the event, at the same time share the live video. The audience can drop their questions under the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat. Let me start with Jim. Jim, welcome to NICE. My question is, what is MCC? Why MCC? How does it work? What was the need to establish MCC? Who are the target beneficiary of MCC? What sector does MCC focus on? Since MCC is a grant-based project, unlike the other projects of the United States, how does MCC draw fund for its project? I'd like to start with you, Jim.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. I spent many years at MCC, as you said in your introduction, and I was there when Nepal first began partnering with MCC, which was, I think, more than 10 years ago. And I've been watching that partnership move forward and sometimes backwards very slowly ever since then. And so I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about the MCC program and the origins of it and the partnership with Nepal. So to answer your questions, I think to understand why the United States created MCC and where the funding comes from, we have to go back and understand why does any country provide assistance to people in another country? And there are various reasons for this, of course, and they're, depending on the type of assistance. But the modern system of providing economic assistance, like MCC, really started after World War II, when the United States was providing European countries with grants and loans through the Marshall Plan. Now, this plan helped create sustained economic growth for both the United States and those countries we were helping in Europe. The goal then, as it is now, was not just to promote joint economic growth, but also to help foster healthy labor markets, boost investment and trade, raise living standards, improve the functioning of markets around the world. It worked in Europe, and it's worked in other places that have received assistance since. Now, MCC was created in 2004, decades after World War II, of course, to help meet those goals that I just outlined in a more effective way. Not everybody in the United States supports providing economic assistance to other countries. In fact, most people don't support providing economic assistance to other countries. So the tension that this creates is a healthy political pressure to make sure that every dollar that the US government spends on grants to other countries is spent effectively. Now, this meant that in 2004, the US decided to change the way it provides assistance for a small amount of its funding, and change that with three main principles in creating MCC. The first one is don't waste money on poorly governed countries. Countries with governments that have no commitment themselves to growing out of poverty, that represents a waste of scarce resources. So MCC will only partner with countries then that are a commitment to good governance and to create a sustainable environment to reduce poverty. MCC was told by the creators of the United States Congress to figure out which countries are committed to good governance. And so they have a scorecard, and they go through a process every year to only choose partners where $1 of MCC funding would be spent effectively. So in this way, MCC is not a gift, it's a partnership. It's a recognition that a country has made tough political reforms and is committed to their own people's poverty reduction. The second major principle that MCC by law is required to follow is that it must respect the sovereignty of the people it is seeking to help, both in determining which projects are going to be funded and also how those projects are going to be implemented. So local populations are smart enough to know what the real problems are in their own country. This might sound revolutionary, but this might not sound revolutionary, it might sound obvious, but it is a real revolution in 2004 and how assistance was provided. If the local population is not part of the solution, then the projects will not be sustainable. And so it's the responsibility of partner governments, in this case Nepal, to carry out those projects themselves. They propose the projects themselves, and then they have to carry out the projects themselves. A unit called the Millennium Challenge Account Nepal. MCC is only there to ensure that these projects are completed on time and without corruption. That's a really critical part. We don't want the money that the US government is providing to be stolen. The third principle is to let economics lead the way. So in the United States, unfortunately, this is a very strange concept, but it's one that's embedded into MCC law. All the projects that are proposed must have proof that they're justified by economics and not politics. These three bedrock principles and MCC's internationally recognized commitment to transparency has made it extremely respected and sought after by countries with emerging markets. Every year, governments all over the world hire lobbyists to try and qualify for MCC funding. And they go to Washington and they say, I'm friends with so-and-so, you have to give us money. You need to give an MCC compact to my client. But the money that these governments spend is a total waste because MCC uses data, measurable facts, to determine who they will partner with and what projects they will fund. So it's a competition to reduce poverty. And one, frankly, that I think Nepal risks losing now because it's taken so long for the agreement, the partnership that was signed in 2017, to actually go into implementation. So now, who makes sure that MCC stays on course for these principles? It's primarily the United States Congress, and actually people like Sarah Rose, we're going to be talking to in a few minutes. The members of Congress are very serious about doing the oversight on MCC to ensure that the executive branch of government does not try to use MCC for purposes that the law prohibits. For instance, no military use of funding is allowed by law. And the members of Congress take it very seriously. And as I said, Sarah Rose and Conor work in think tanks that track MCC very closely to make sure that they don't deviate from these principles. Congress looks at every grant to see if the economic benefits that are promised will be enough to justify the cost of the projects. So now, given that the partnership with Nepal was signed in 2017, I'm surprised that Congress, which is providing US taxpayer dollars, has not demanded that MCC take back funding that's been set aside for Nepal. There are many uses domestically and even other MCC countries that they could have for this funding. If the government of Nepal doesn't want to actually finalize the compact, move forward to build the safer roads and have better access to electricity that is included in the partnership, Congress could say those funds need to go elsewhere. And other partnerships that were signed around 2017, like the Nepal Compact, are already close to finishing when the Nepal Compact isn't even started yet. So, for instance, Morocco is almost ready to finish. Niger is almost ready to finish. And these were partnerships that were signed back around the same time that Nepal was. So I hope that gives the overview that you were asking for. If not, I'm happy to answer more questions, but I'll turn it over back to you.
Thank you, Jim, for your response. We have received lots of questions, but I'll come to that after we are done with all the three speakers first. Let me move to Mr. Conor. Mr. Conor, how is MCC different from USAID and other development models? What are the success stories of MCC? And why did it fail in some of the countries, for example, Sri Lanka? When it comes to the hard infrastructure project that MCC focuses on, it is often compared to China's Belt and Road Initiative project. How does China comes across the MCC radar?
Thanks so much, and it's great to be here today with NICE. Thanks to everyone joining. I know it's evening in Nepal, so we really appreciate it. And thanks to Jim and Sarah for being part of this great panel discussion today. In terms of how MCC is different from USAID, I think Jim highlighted some of the key areas, and I'll just tease some of that out a little bit further. First, MCC has the scorecard, as Jim mentioned, and it is only focused on countries that are seen as high performing. USAID is in 85 countries around the world, and it programs across multiple sectors. In fact, nearly every sector that you can think of from a development perspective. MCC has taken a far more targeted approach in how it programs its funds, and that's really driven by the process that Jim described, where MCC enters into a close partnership with a country. They undertake what's called a constraints to growth analysis that seeks to identify binding constraints to economic growth in the country in question. And then in partnership with the country, MCC and the country co-design projects that are meant to address these binding constraints of growth. And so what you end up having is a 5-year partnership that is usually several $100 million in size, but has 3 or 4, maybe less projects that are very specifically targeted to addressing these binding constraints to growth. MCC also, from the beginning, has had a mandate to evaluate and to monitor the impact that the projects are achieving. There's been a commitment to use of evidence in designing the projects, and this really stands in marked contrast to the vast majority of USAID projects that still are not evaluated, and not in the way that MCC compacts are. So this has really given us a good understanding of how the actual impact that MCC is having through its country compact system. And importantly, it uses an economic rate of return as a common indicator. And so there is a way to really understand across the different compacts the impact that MCC is having through its work. I think in terms of its success, MCC has had a lot of success at the country level. I think you've seen multiple projects. I'm thinking of in places like Ghana, where it's constructed a highway that has really generated a lot of economic return for the projects. It's undertaken land reform in a number of compacts that has also generated clear economic returns. MCC has had a lot of success, and I think I'm going to tie this to where I see failure. And what I want to say is I see it in sort of failure with MCC in sort of two things. I think at the macro level, as Jim noted, MCC was launched in 2004 with a commitment to working with countries that were making progress on the governance side, on governance, that had a strong commitment to governance reform and had a strong commitment to economic reform, to creating a market-based economic growth. There was a sense at the time that MCC could be a transformational approach, that it could really, by taking this very targeted slug or large chunk of money and directing it towards what were clearly identified as the binding constraints to growth, that you could transform development in a particular country. And I think we've never really truly seen that. I think that's reflected by the fact that you've seen, rather than just one compact in a country, you've now seen multiple compacts in some countries. Ghana has had 2 compacts, Cape Verde has had 2 compacts, the Philippines is developing a second compact, Indonesia is developing a second compact. So it's never quite achieved that transformational approach. And I think you've sort of seen it kind of step back from that over time. And I think where I would say there's been sort of micro failures, you've seen compacts suspended. Madagascar is a good example of this. Tanzania's second compact was suspended. You mentioned some of the issues with Sri Lanka. And that reflects the reality that in a lot of contexts, the commitment to governance reform, the commitment to growth reform is very challenging. It's not as simple as we want it to be sometimes. And it has made it very difficult in some contexts to continue the compact because of the, as Jim mentioned, the scorecards and the hurdles that are associated with that, the high hurdles are the hard hurdles that are associated with it. If things happen like a coup, if there is backsliding on corruption indicators, the MCC is dedicated to ending it. And I think in some ways that's actually refreshing because it is saying, no, we need to see a commitment if we're going to continue funding the projects under the compacts. I think where we've often seen issues is with other development programs, you've simply continued the funding and there's no accountability with the country that it needs to be accountability is a two-way street. Yes, there's accountability on our side, but there needs to be accountability on the other side as well. And that commitment to maintaining the reforms that would actually, I think, get you to where you want to be over time from a transformational perspective. And so it's hard for me, I don't see it, it's hard to really characterize it as a failure. I actually think it's one of the stronger aspects of the MCC model is that it's not just the commitment to funding something, it's also saying we're going to stop if we don't feel like the commitment to reform remains strong. You bring up China, and I think this is an interesting perspective, and you're absolutely right. MCC is sometimes seen as part of the US response to the Belt and Road Initiative. This is because the vast majority of MCC compact dollars have been programmed toward infrastructure projects. Something like, at last count, I think it was something like 70% or so over the history of MCC has gone toward hard infrastructure projects. This represents the reality on the ground that lack of functioning infrastructure does present a binding constraint to growth in a lot of the contexts. The reality is that prior to MCC, the US government had largely gotten out of the infrastructure game. We were not funding infrastructure through our other development agencies. This is something that we had done many, many years ago, but had largely moved away from in the 1970s and 1980s over sustainability issues and the belief that aid should be directed toward meeting basic human needs. So MCC is part of that. I think the reality is it can only do so much when you look at it in terms of the amount of money, and so therefore you have to see it as a component of a broader U.S. response alongside the Development Finance Corporation that you mentioned, that Jim was instrumental in moving during the Trump administration, but also alongside our other tools like AID and the State Department and other development agencies. And I think, again, it's on the part of the United States government to really to present this as an alternative, to present this as a more sustainable approach to the model that China's offering via Belt and Road, which is by and large state-to-state loan financing for infrastructure projects that are not necessarily tied to the same kind of economic analysis that MCC, for example, offers, or the Development Finance Corporation offers via the private sector. People have talked about that sustainability. This is absolutely part of the China model, and I think it's one that we should all be concerned about. And again, I would say MCC and the DFC, the U.S. government offers a more sustainable model that's built on analysis, that's built on building projects that will actually achieve growth or help to achieve growth in the long run. So with that, I'll conclude and look forward to taking questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Conor, for your remarks. Let me move to Sarah. Sarah, you have worked on MCC projects, and also why was Nepal chosen as MCC's partner country? Why should MCC be desirable to countries like Nepal? What are the terms and conditions that Nepal has to abide by if the project gets ratified in the parliament? Why has MCC become a subject of controversy in many countries, including Nepal? Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, and thank you very much to NICE for hosting this event here. So the Center for Global Development, where I work, is also a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that focuses on issues relevant to global development. And I have been focused on, as part of my work, providing an independent voice on sort of the policies and operations of MCC, over the last 10 years. And so I really welcome the opportunity to be able to collaborate with a think tank who is exploring similar issues. And so these are really good questions. And I think, my remarks are really going to build on some of the points that Jim and Conor have previously made, but I think they are important to answer some of these questions. And so, the first is, why Nepal? Why was Nepal chosen as MCC's partner country? And so, as Jim mentioned, MCC's partnership with Nepal really extends back 10 years. MCC first selected Nepal to participate in a smaller program called a Threshold program back in 2011. So the Threshold program, just for a bit of background, is a smaller amount of grant financing than the Compact, which is, of course, what's been signed in Nepal now. It's usually just 2 to 3 years or so. And it's sort of an initial step in many cases on the way to being eligible for a Compact. And I think this really needs to be, based in something that both Jim and Conor have both mentioned, which is that MCC works only with countries that are committed to good governance. And MCC has tried its hardest to assess this in an impartial and in a comparative way, looking across sort of 80 or so low and lower middle income countries that could be candidates for MCC assistance. And so for countries to be considered for funding, they need to be able to meet certain standards on these scorecards that MCC has compiled. Now, these scorecards are compilations of 20 different policy indicators from independent sources, places like Freedom House, the World Bank, from UN agencies. They're not produced by MCC themselves or the US government for that matter. And these indicators measure aspects of governance, of economic policy, and of social investment. And so going back to 2011, MCC selected Nepal at the time because it did meet the criteria for eligibility on the scorecard, but it hadn't done so consistently in the past. And so the goal of the Threshold program in that case was to really initiate the partnership in an acknowledgement of the strong bilateral partnership that MCC, that the US has had with Nepal over many years, and the trajectory that many were witnessing in Nepal at that time. So then the goal is to initiate the partnership and get started on some of these initial steps that would ultimately feed into the development of a compact. In particular, doing what I think Jim and Conor both mentioned, this analysis of constraints to growth that would help guide either what the investments would be under a threshold program or under a compact investment. And so at that point, there were two options of how this was going to look. Nepal was either going to become eligible for a compact or it would continue on with its threshold program. But actually, they completed the constraints to growth, but then in 2014, they didn't proceed with the threshold program because MCC decided to select Nepal for a compact instead. It recognized that it had very strong performance on the scorecards across time, as well as strengthened democratic institutions recently as well. And I think this is really worth noting because it's not easy to meet MCC scorecard criteria. There aren't very many countries that really do sort of pass that screen, if you will. But Nepal has met those criteria on the scorecard again for 12 of the last 13 years. And this really makes it one of the best and most consistent performers among these 80 or so low and lower middle income countries that MCC assesses. So why should MCC be desirable to a country like Nepal? I think that's a good question. I'm going to point to four things here. So the first, and this is somewhat obvious, is that it's grant funding. So in Nepal's case, it's $500 million of grant funding. There's nothing to be repaid. The government of Nepal, yes, is putting in $130 million in co-financing toward the program objectives, but the funds that are coming from MCC are pure grant money. The second, and this is again response to what Jim had identified, is that the compact really does respond to Nepali identified priorities. So investments in electricity transmission and road maintenance emerged as these key constraints to growth in this diagnostic that was conducted jointly by teams of economists within the government of Nepal, as well as within the United States government, both from MCC and USAID as well. And then the projects were ultimately selected by the government of Nepal in consultation with the Nepali private sector and civil society, which helped inform that decision-making. And I think it's worth noting too that the electricity transmission project, which is included in MCC's compact, reflects the priorities that were outlined in Nepal's own transmission master plan that was created in 2014 and then updated a few years later. And then in addition to this priority setting, Nepal also plays a lead role, the government of Nepal will play a lead role in implementing the compact. The government has set up a unit to run the procurements and manage the contracts for the work. And there's also a completely Nepali oversight board that is set up as well, with members of the government as well as members of private sector and civil society who will help steer and manage the work of the compact if it goes forward. So the third thing I want to mention is the benefits to the Nepali people. So I haven't done an independent analysis of this, but just looking at MCC's analysis done by their economists, it estimates that 23 million Nepalis will ultimately benefit from the investments. And a little bit under half of those live on less than $4 a day, $40 US a day. So the last thing I want to note about why this could be desirable to the people of Nepal really focuses on program quality. And again, I'm going to go back to a few things that Jim mentioned in his earlier remarks. So, and this goes back really to MCC's founding as well. So when MCC was founded in 2004, there was really this widespread skepticism about the effectiveness of foreign aid in general. So critics, and there were a lot of critics, said, that really too much aid is being spent on bad projects in service of poorly defined objectives with no sense at all about what was achieved at the end. And others pointed out that, when you mix things like foreign policy goals with development goals, really this pursuit of development outcomes gets muddled and sometimes undermined by foreign policy objectives. So MCC was founded very expressly in response to those criticisms of aid. It was to have a singular focus, which was poverty reduction and economic growth, and this was notably separated from foreign policy goals. And it was going to pursue measurable and cost-effective results. And it does, right? So I spent a lot of my time at CGD exhorting the USAID system to take results measurement a lot more seriously and to invest in it more. This is something there's, I think, a lot of room for improvement within the US government's aid practices in general. But MCC has really been at the leading edge here, right? So economic analysis informs the sectors in which it's going to invest. MCC uses cost-benefit analysis to determine which interventions are likely to really yield the most value for money. And then it rigorously evaluates the vast majority of the projects in its portfolio. And actually, you can see a summary of the agency's thinking about sort of the economic analysis, the monitoring and evaluation plans in the Nepal Compact document itself, which is publicly available on MCC's website. And so because MCC's premise is really about measuring results, its overseers really hold it accountable for doing so. And that includes think tanks like Center for Global Development, but as well as the US Congress. And so that doesn't mean that all of MCC's investments have really met their goals, but they've also been transparent about that. But in contrast to way too many aid programs, they really are designed in an evidence-informed way with results really at the center. And so, I mentioned the compact document. There was a question about, what are the terms and conditions that Nepal would have to abide by if it gets ratified in the parliament? And that's a good question, right? And so I would point again to the compact, which is a publicly available document, which does outline the terms and conditions. And so, most of these are very similar across all of MCC's compacts. They have to do with things like completing the project within 5 years. That's something that's mandated to MCC by our laws, that it has to be completed within 5 years. Things like adherence to environmental standards, which are very similar to those that are used by the World Bank and other donors. And also, pieces that say things like MCC can't use funds to go towards things like military training, because that's prohibited by US law, that procurements must be open and competitive, and that there's no other misuse of funds. The other requirement as part of compacts is that any country that signs a compact with MCC, there is the expectation that that country would uphold those good governance practices sort of according to the standards for MCC eligibility. And I think this is something that Conor mentioned too. And so the idea is that that the country would continue to sort of pursue the practices and policies of democratic governance, sound economic policy that it had been pursuing at the time when it was selected. And MCC has in fact cut off programs in the past when, for instance, countries have had a military coup, or when there have been major crackdowns on civic and political participation. So those kinds of things are also included in the compact. There are some specific conditions as well. It looks like there is an expectation that there would be a plan for sort of the key financial and technical terms for the construction of the transmission line, that there would be required the passage or at least progress towards passage of the Electricity Regulatory Commission bill and things like that. But again, these are all included in the compact and are set forth. And I think this last question is an important one, the one that you asked about. Why has MCC become a subject of controversy in many countries? So I think the way that I really want to address that is by saying that, government officials, lawmakers, civil society organizations, and other members of the public are right to scrutinize the deals and the contracts that their country enters into. This is an important part of a democratic society. And MCC only works with democratic countries. And so in many ways, this healthy debate and discussion is to be expected and encouraged, in fact, as well. So there are a few areas where those who are scrutinizing the MCC and Nepal Compact might raise questions as part of the research that they do. And, these might be questions like, does this have something to do with the US's relationship with China, right? It's not hard to observe that China and strategic competition occupies considerable space in US policy. Other questions like, are there national security or foreign policy dimensions to the compact? MCC, after all, is an agency of the US government. It has a board of directors, which is chaired by the US Secretary of State. And, to be honest, even within the United States, there can sometimes be confusion about MCC's role within sort of the broader aid apparatus and foreign policy apparatus as well. So these are questions, and these are questions, again, that are legitimate and should be asked. But again, to answer these, I would really point back to MCC's, its premise, why it was set up, and how it's different. And so it was, in fact, set up to very intentionally separate this pursuit of development from the pursuit of foreign policy, under the acknowledgement that these results, that MCC development results, if you will, that MCC is tied to very, by law in the US government, can get muddled when mixed with foreign policy. And so, now there are times that these lines have been a little bit blurred. I can certainly give examples, but there's pushback when that happens within the United States. And the main issue is that MCC's goals, which again, it will seek to measure, are really around these development objectives. And again, as for the military question, I want to reiterate what Jim had said, is that MCC is restricted by law from using its funds for any military purpose, and also that the Department of Defense does not sit on MCC's board. And so, I mean, it's right to ask questions. It's right to seek additional information. But it's also important, I think, to understand the angles, the interests of those presenting arguments. I think, we're lucky in many ways to live in an environment that is, rich with so much information, with a diversity of sources and points of view. I mean, I work at a think tank, right? And so as someone who trades in ideas, I think it's critical to have this rich environment for discussion and debate. But the flip side of this, of course, is that it can be difficult to sift through and separate information from misinformation. And this is true around the world. And so, again, I think this brings me back to really being grateful for the opportunity to have this session today to help share some facts and perspectives that we see from where we sit about MCC. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jim and Conor. Now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. We have already received a huge number of questions, and that was the reason that we started the program 10 minutes before the schedule, as we wanted to have a robust and detailed discussion. There are lots of questions. I think almost 80 questions is only one issue. That is, is there a link between MCC and Indo-Pacific strategy? Is in Nepal, often MCC is linked with Indo-Pacific strategy. So do you think there is any link between the two? There are almost 100 of questions on this issue, and I'm sure many will be popping up in next 10 to 15 minutes. So I'd like to go to each one of the panelists on this question. Maybe you can start with Jim.
Yeah, so the partnership with MCC and Nepal started long before the Indo-Pacific strategy was starting to get developed, which is a fairly recent strategy. So the partnership, as Sarah outlined, started, I guess, 2011 with the Threshold Program in order to meet the objectives of Nepal and MCC. So I think that's the answer. It's the partnership existed long before the United States and India and other allies in the Pacific were seeking closer ties. And as far as I know, it has nothing to do with it. The United States, for the last number of years, does have an interest in promoting allies throughout the Indo-Pacific region, Australia and others. But again, this compact was negotiated, and the partnership for the compact was agreed to way back and finalized way back in 2017, before there was any sort of discussion about this. So that's my thought. I don't know if the others have.
Mr. Conor, would you like to add?
No, I don't. There's not much to add. I think Jim tackled that well, but I guess I would just underscore a little bit of what Sarah said in her remarks is, MCC is largely, it is meant to be free of the foreign policy objectives that often influence other parts of U.S. foreign assistance. It's not as direct, it's not directly tied to it in the way that USAID is more directly tied to the State Department and sort of often is used for more direct U.S. national security or foreign policy objectives. And that is by design, as Sarah mentioned. So yeah, Jim, I think took that well, but I'd just underscore that point.
Sarah, would you like to add anything to it?
I think it would be hard to add to what my colleagues have said there. I think that's exactly right, to point that the agreement long predates the Indo-Pacific strategy, and it is entirely separate. The compact is not an agreement under that strategy.
Let me move to the next question, which is almost similar.
Can I just say, let me just add on to this, that's what both people said. It's one of the reasons why the transparency element of MCC is so important. So anybody in Nepal can go online and see, does my government meet the minimum qualifications for being well governed enough? How does my government compare to other governments that MCC funds in Africa, for instance? All the governments are ranked against each other, and it's all transparent. So if Nepal did not meet the criteria, did not finish high up in the competition with other governments all across the world, then they wouldn't be eligible for this. There are other countries in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, that the State Department would love for MCC to work with, and they don't. I won't name them here because I don't want to give anybody a bad name, but there aren't that many countries that are qualifying for MCC that would be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So why I don't understand the basis for the question to think, why Nepal? Why not Vietnam? Why not all these other places? They don't qualify for MCC funds because of the transparency. Anybody in Nepal can go online and see that why they qualify for MCC funds. The transparency is a hallmark of MCC for just this reason, in case people have questions about it because of this.
Let me go to Mr. Conor. Mr. Conor, do you think there is a role of regional powers or geopolitical factor behind making MCC controversial or making it difficult to get endorsed because Sri Lanka and even Nepal raises the issue of sovereignty, that MCC hurts the sovereignty of the country? Was it easy for Sri Lanka, that is facing economic crisis at the moment, reject such a huge grant while the nation is acquiring loans from China and getting into debt trap? So how would you like to react to it?
Yeah, I think on the question of sovereignty, the MCC model very clearly turns the sort of, I would say, most development models on its head, in that it is designed in partnership with the country. So Nepal worked with the MCC to design the compact projects. There is agreement, and it will be implemented by a staff that is overwhelmingly majority Nepalese, and it's based in Kathmandu, and it's run as an adjunct to the Nepalese government. This is very clear. This is the model that MCC very much took on. It's one that I think is part of a response to the need for greater country ownership in development. USAID is not there. And so it is a much different, I think, from a sovereignty perspective. MCC really is meant to do no harm from a sovereignty perspective. But as Sarah and as Jim and as I've said, I think there is still there can still be concerns once a compact is underway that may lead to the compact being canceled or suspended because there has been backsliding, or because there's been a coup. In the case of Mali, for example, a compact was suspended there. Madagascar, the same thing. This happens. I think from a regional perspective, when you're looking at countries like Nepal or Sri Lanka, obviously there are geostrategic considerations here. Sri Lanka, with the port that the Chinese built, there are some serious concerns. That is, however, not, as we've talked about, I think that is not what is driving MCC compacts in these countries. There are other ways in which the US government would seek to influence or engage the geostrategic issues that are emerging in the region, either via our partners or directly with the governments themselves via our other means to engage, whether it's the State Department, USAID, the Development Finance Corporation, other tools like that.
Jim or Sarah, would you like to add to it? Okay, let me move to the next question to Sarah. Sarah, if Nepal do not approve MCC, what will Nepal lose? There is a fear in Nepal that if MCC is not passed, it will isolate Nepal among the international community in general and US in particular. How far is true? Do you think it is likely that Nepal will be isolated among international community or in United States for not getting such a wonderful grant being endorsed by the parliament?
That's a good question. And I think I want to point to what Conor mentioned before, is that MCC is one of the tools that the US government brings to bear in its relationships with other countries. And quite frankly, it's a relatively small tool as well. And I wish I had the figures in front of me, but my sense is that USAID, for instance, which is the largest aid agency within the United States, has a Nepal program, a fairly large program in Nepal as well. There are other ways that the US engages with the government of Nepal and the people of Nepal beyond the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And so, if the government of Nepal or the political leadership of Nepal were to choose not to proceed with the MCC compact, that would not have, ramifications for the rest of the relationship with the United States or with the international community writ large. What Nepal would stand to lose would be this, again, $500 million in grant financing, which it wouldn't have to pay back, support for advancing some of these national priorities in electricity transmission, in reducing the costs and time of transport to be able to exchange goods, to be able to increase jobs, et cetera. This grant program that could benefit, 23 million Nepali citizens. And so that is the main cost in many ways. The cost is to the people that would stand to benefit from this grant investment. But in terms of, sort of the broader ramifications as well, again, I just do want to highlight that MCC is one of the the agencies within the U.S. government that has relationships with partner countries.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me go to Sarah once again. We all know that MCC is highly politicized here in Nepal. It would not be surprising if it is not endorsed by the Nepalese parliament. If MCC fails in Nepal, should United States government spend the same fund in the same sector, that is transmission line and roads, through USAID? What benefit would Nepal had made if Nepal had received those infrastructure through MCC, not USAID?
And that's another good question. And so, again, I think this is going to tie a little bit to something that someone touched on early, and I apologize, I don't remember if it was Jim or Conor who mentioned it, but MCC's I think the question was around why so much in infrastructure. And again, so the compact that's on the table in Nepal is very much an infrastructure compact, looking at road maintenance, looking at electricity transmission. And part of the answer to that question is because, these have been underfunded in a lot of ways, right? And in particular, there's not a lot of grant financing that's available for infrastructure projects. There may be, concessional lending that's available for a lot of these infrastructure programs, but again, not as much grant financing that is out there. USAID in particular, just based on the way that it is set up and the laws and regulations that are around USAID, is that it is very constrained in how it spends its money. The United States Congress dictates largely how USAID is going to spend its money in each country. A huge chunk of USAID money is reserved for things like global health. There's also education programs, governance kinds of programs. USAID has very little discretionary funding to be able to pivot, from what the Congress has said that it needs to be spending its money on in particular areas. USAID has very little money for things like infrastructure projects to support things like road maintenance and electricity transmission. And so my perspective is that it would be very unlikely that, if the MCC compact were not to go forward, that USAID would be able to pick up a significant portion or much at all of the financing that would have been on the table from MCC.
Let me go to James. James, Nepal has asked for some amendments in MCC compact. US has rejected this idea. If some changes or amendment can get the project endorsed by the Nepalese parliament, what is the harm in getting it ratified?
I think the premise of your question is maybe the compact needs to be amended. Some people feel the compact needs to be amended in order to get it ratified. The compact was negotiated, with two sovereign countries. Nepal is a sovereign country, and it's in a partnership with the United States. And there are rules and responsibilities in the compact laid out for both parties. The United States needs to make sure that it doesn't start funding it and then pull away funding. The United States has to, maintain its good faith and credit in the compact, and Nepal has to take those funds and then implement the projects as negotiated. It took years to negotiate this with the government of Nepal, and And it was agreed to by both parties at very high levels. It was reviewed by the Justice Department in Nepal. It was reviewed by lawyers in the US government to ensure that the sovereignty of both countries were maintained and that the projects were relevant and right. So it's been signed, it's done. At some point you have to stop and move forward. And, you know, MCC requires parliaments of the partner countries to ratify it because it is an international agreement between two sovereign countries. And we have to ensure that the people as represented by their parliamentarians are fully endorsed the projects and what we're doing, and because it's not easy. Getting an MCC compact isn't easy, and implementing them are not easy. You have to do it within 5 years. There's a lot of, as Conor and Sarah said, there's a lot of infrastructure involved. You have to meet timelines. You have to get these projects done, or the money goes away. So because of that, there's a responsibility that the government has to meet to its people and to the United States. So as far as I know, the compact has been negotiated, and it's along the same lines as every other compact that MCC has partnered with, every other country that MCC has partnered with. I don't know what they're up to, 30 or so compacts. And it's either time to move on or walk away.
Thank you, Jim. Mr. Conor, would you like to react on either of the two questions, whether Nepal will be isolated among international community if MCC is not endorsed, or do you think that Nepal, US should allow some time, US should allow that amendment so that it is rectified and the project goes smooth?
I don't have much else to add from what Sarah and Jim said. I think just to underscore Sarah's point, I don't really see isolation happening, given that, you know, as she very clearly laid out, I mean, USAID has a large mission presence in Nepal. It's been a long-running presence. State Department, obviously, we have our embassy. You know, I find it's again, I'd really underscore it's one piece of our overall relationship with the country of Nepal, and that's true for all countries that receive MCC compacts. It's one piece of how the U.S. government engages, and so I don't really see isolation happening. And just on Jim's points, I mean, I'd underscore that I think the compact's been negotiated. It's based on solid analysis, and the projects that were developed were co-developed between MCC and the government of Nepal. I think that it should go forward, and it would be a shame that this didn't go forward at this point.
Let me, like all of our panelists are working on US development projects. So we all know that the case of MCC in Nepal is not encouraging. So how is America's experience in dealing with the development projects under USAID? Is it different from MCC, or we have similar stories? Is it, secondly, like you may also share the experience of MCC and USAID or USAID issues in other countries where these institutions are working. So maybe we can go with Sarah, like, is MCC different from USAID, or even working through USAID is also having similar issues where it is not so easy to get development projects smooth? So we'd like to start with Sarah.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so, you know, I think in many ways, you know, USAID and MCC have a number of shared objectives in many ways, right? They're both development organizations. They both are looking to produce high quality projects that can, you know, respond to needs in a particular country. But I do want to highlight that the way that the two agencies sort of go about things is a bit different, right? And so first is again on the selection of countries. So USAID works with 100+ countries around the world, and MCC works with, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but maybe 20 at any given time. Again, based on sort of their selection criteria, and the way that they develop programs is different as well. And so, you know, when MCC starts a conversation with a country, and the first thing that they do is undertake this constraints to growth. They say, what are your priorities? You know, what do we think is going to really help, move the needle, if you will, on reducing some of these barriers that constrain the ability to have more jobs available, to grow the economy. USAID is a little bit different. As I said, USAID has money that that can respond to priorities as well. But again, because so much of its budget is dictated in many ways by the U.S. Congress, it doesn't come to an initial conversation in as sort of a blank slate kind of way. And so USAID may come to a particular country saying, we have X dollars for global health. And then from within that, they can have a conversation with the government or civil society organizations or subnational governments about what priorities might be within that. But again, there are very specific pockets of money that USAID has. They have, even within global health, they might say, and then we have, this chunk of money, this large chunk is reserved for combating HIV, for instance, again. So, in many ways, MCC is able to come to that initial conversation in a way that is more of a blank slate, that enables sort of more input from the country in terms of sort of this participation. Are there questions, are there other, does USAID face similar questions about how it's spending its money in other countries? That's a good question. I don't have a lot of specific examples in my head of when that may have happened. I expect that it is probably true that there are questions about how USAID is spending its money. I can think of a couple of examples in Bolivia, for instance, back in 2008. 2009, perhaps. Well, I think actually maybe this wasn't USA, but it was questions about the extent to which democracy and governance programs that were supported by USAID were of a broader concern to the ruling government at that time. And so I think that there were some questions and some controversy locally about that as well. And so certainly, when there is an international party that is working in partnership in a different country, there will and there should be questions about what that relationship looks like. Again, I think this is part of being a democratic society and being involved as a responsible citizen, as a responsible lawmaker, is to be able to ask some of those questions about what these relationships look like. So I think along the history there have been these kinds of questions that the United States as a provider of aid have certainly faced. But again, the differences between USAID, I feel like I'm circling back now, but there are other differences between USAID and MCC that I think are worth pointing out too, and that's in the implementation. And so with USAID and with MCC both, they both rely on contractors to do their work, right, to actually implement the projects. But in the case of MCC, it is really this unit that is set up by the government that is running the procurements for those contracts, that is managing the contracts. And in the case of USAID, it is USAID that is doing those things. And so I think that's another key difference to bear in mind as well. And I'll pause if anyone else has anything.
Let me just.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, Jim, over to you.
Conor is on mute, so I'm faster. Two things.
Go,
One
Jim,
is
go.
When Sarah says the government, she means the Nepal government, not the US government. The Nepal government or the Moldovan government or the Niger government, they're the ones who have to implement the MCC projects because it is owned by the people in that country, unlike USAID, where USAID is actually implementing those. And that means putting out the procurements and the contracts and overseeing it and making sure it gets done. There is some overlap, as Sarah said. In some countries, USAID, for instance, in Moldova, USAID was working on irrigation systems in one part of the country. And the Moldovans saw that and they saw it was a good program and it was working. And they came, when they were producing their list of proposals to MCC, they said, can you replicate that in a different part of the country? So they weren't working, MCC wasn't working where USAID was working, but they were doing the same things. They were taking that same program that had been proven to be working well. And the Moldovans said, can you also do it over here? In Jordan, there was a wastewater treatment plant that the government needed to expand. They wanted to expand that. And it had been built originally in the 70s, I think, or the 80s by USAID. And so it had to double in size. But again, it was the people of Jordan, it was the Jordanian government who said, this is good, it's just not enough. Can you help us make it bigger? And so being driven by local needs allows MCC to sometimes do what USAID is doing and sometimes do things that are totally different.
Mr. Conor?
Yeah, I just want to underscore a little bit of what Sarah said on the sort of the difference between AID and MCC. And I think really, she hit on this in that AID is very constrained because of the way the money that AID gets from Congress. Congress has a lot of say in where AID spends and on what AID spends its money on. So like she said, they get a certain amount of money for global health, a certain amount of money for education, a certain amount of money for agricultural development, and so on and so forth. And, again, unlike MCC, which is, as she said, a blank slate when it comes to a particular country, AID tends to say, okay, well, we have this much money for this particular sector, so then they'll design the projects and programs that will fit within that sector. And there's relatively little, not none, but there is relatively little input from the local government or from local civil society. I wouldn't say none, but there's not a lot. And, again, MCC really engages in partnership, and I believe in a genuine partnership with the local government to design the projects, and then the local government, as Jim said, implements the projects. And that is an important distinction. It is, if you care about the effectiveness of aid, small a, aid, assistance, MCC is effective. It delivers country ownership in a way that a lot of other development programming from the United States does not. It respects the sovereignty of the local government in a way that you could perhaps make an argument that other development assistance does not always do so.
Can I build on that? Because I see a question in the chat about local laws and which laws prevail, and the question in the chat is just, as far as I know, incorrect. So I'd like to clarify. MCC the compact doesn't necessarily prevail over local laws. The Constitution of Nepal is paramount in any partnership, and MCC doesn't want to break any laws. So that's why it's part of a negotiation with the local government, and that's why Parliament has to look at it. And from what I understand, the Department of Justice in Nepal has looked at it and says that there are no laws that the compact breaks, because that just wouldn't be a part of it. There are times perhaps when an MCC person who's in country has to have, they're part of the embassy and they have the protections of the embassy like any US diplomat, like Nepal diplomats have in the United States, the same reciprocity. There are sometimes issues around tax. There are some countries in Africa that have wanted to tax the grant dollars or tax the people who are working on it. And so, obviously if this is a funding from the US government, having something taxed is not really appropriate. Those types of things are all spelled out though in the compact. It's all transparent. You can all see it on the compact, and there's no attempt to prevail over local law at all. If anything, the compact is going to ensure that certain environmental and social and governance standards are higher than local law. I don't know if that's the case in Nepal or not. I don't know about Nepal's law, but MCC has to make sure that they don't, in any projects that we're funding, and the Nepal government is implementing, we have to have very high standards to ensure that there's no environmental degradation, that if anybody has to be displaced, that they're fairly compensated and moved to a good place. Those are the types of provisions that might not be in Nepal law, but are going to be in the compact to ensure that Nepal is, better off than when MCC started.
Thank you, James. We still have lots of questions. I can see around 230 questions that has been collected by our team here, and we have 5 minutes. So, and we can't even plug them, but maximum question are military aspect, like whether it has some military component, whether it's a part of Indo-Pacific. James was talking about law, so there are lots of questions on law, that whether MCC, whether the local law has lack of access on MCC project. Similarly, why is India in the picture and all those? There's another one question, very naive, and I want to end with that very simple question that that the MCC is delayed by years. How much has it cost to Nepal? How much is the delay? How much this delay has cost to Nepal? Or what has Nepal missed? Similarly, there's another that what are the gains of American government if MCC is endorsed? If MCC succeeds in constructing electric transmission lines and road maintenance, how it will serve American interest, how it will fulfill America's interest. I think maybe each one of you can take 1 or 2 minutes and try to answer these questions, and we'll end it with it. Sarah, shall we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. Lots of good questions. I wish we had more time to cover more of them. These are important, and it's important to have this discussion. What is the cost of the delay? That's an interesting question, isn't it? In some ways, there doesn't have to be a cost either, because there is still an opportunity to move forward with this project. At which point it would have been delayed, but the cost, ultimately no cost would be incurred. And certainly, I would say that over the last couple of years, MCC projects that have been in implementation have been slowed a lot by the global COVID-19 pandemic as well. And so in many ways, the time is fortuitous as we hope within the next few years, hopefully the world will emerge from the situation in which we find ourselves as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so again, I think it doesn't have to be a lost opportunity at this point, because there is still opportunity to move forward. The question about what does the US gain from the compact success. I think that's a good question. It's again, part of, MCC's sort of, principles are that it is designed to be focused on sort of development outcomes versus outcomes that are within the, the self-interests of the United States. But that said, the United States, of course, like any country in the world, has an interest in economic growth worldwide, right? Because we do live in a globally interconnected economy, and there are more opportunities, globally. The more jobs there are, the more commerce there is that's available. Again, and it's not necessarily just in the interest of the United States, but it's in the interests of all who may potentially trade with Nepal in the future. So I'll stop there.
Jim, would you like to add to it?
I thought Conor was going to go, and I wouldn't have to think of anything new. But I would say that there is some cost to Nepal for not moving forward, and there are what we would call opportunity costs. So had this been implemented in 2017, when it was signed, and maybe a year or so later, because it always takes a little bit of time for the local governments to set up the units. And so say if it had been worked in 2018, how many people have died on the roads in Nepal that MCC was working to try to make safer and better? How much more economic activity would have been created if the transmission lines and the power and the reliable power had been turned on by now? How many rural communities would have electricity now if over the last, whatever it's been, 5 years or so, if we had moved forward with this? How many people couldn't get to the hospital, or how many hospitals didn't have electricity because the compact didn't move forward? That's a really tremendous social cost. How much money would have Nepal made by selling their electricity to India? A significant amount. So I feel bad for the people of Nepal that it has cost them so much in the social capital, the social good.
Mr. Conor?
Yeah, I mean, it's always nice to go last because I can just echo what my two more brilliant panelists than I am said. But no, I think, to split the difference between Sarah and Jim, I mean, I think Jim's absolutely right. There has been an opportunity cost, as he very eloquently outlined just now. But as Sarah says, if we can take this forward, then we don't have to lose more. And I think there is a clear opportunity here to move the compact forward, to get it implemented, get it done. And that will benefit Nepal. in all of the ways that in the losses that Jim outlined, I think in all of the ways it can benefit you, there's a very clear positive benefit here. And just on benefiting U.S. interests, I mean, the United States obviously has an interest in seeing economic growth, stability in a country like Nepal, as others have alluded to. It is in a geostrategically important region of the world. But our primary interest with the compact is to see the economic development of Nepal and the benefits that will accrue on the social development side, whether it's better health outcomes, better education, et cetera, et cetera. But it is in our interest. As Sarah said, we live in a globally connected world, and whether there are people in our country who don't believe that and elsewhere, it does matter. And it is in our interest to see economic development take hold in a country like Nepal or in Sri Lanka or wherever. And I sincerely hope that this compact goes forward, because I think one of the secondary benefits is it will strengthen the relationship between the United States and Nepal. And I hope that we can continue to be seen as a good partner and as one who's trying to bring good benefits to the citizens of Nepal.
Thank you. Dear Sarah Rose, Jim Mozzarella, and Conor Savoy, thank you so much for your valuable time and experts' comments. We'd love to engage in this kind of engagement in future as well, because at NICE, we believe that these kind of discussions are important. These kind of discussions are important at people-to-people level as well, apart from the government-to-government level. So, but I think this kind of frank discussion helps in clarifying and removing misinformation and disinformation. Hence, thank you so much for your time. We'd also like to thank our participants, audience, for their wonderful question. We still have lots of questions, but we'll have to take them to our next session. Dear panelists, have a nice day and good night to our participants from Nepal.